and welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
And I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor podcast, and today we're talking about two intersecting topics. So managers who manage managers, which is a lot of managing, and quiet quitting. There's a lot of, Kim, we like to get into assonance with our words here. There's managers managing managers and quiet quitting. First, let's agree on what we mean by quiet quitting. I will offer up one definition, and I want to get your perspective, Kim and Jason, on this. From Gallup, quiet quitting is the idea spreading virally on social media that millions of people are not going above and beyond at work and just meeting their job description, end quote. And Gallup notes that this is a problem because, quote, most jobs today require some level of extra effort to collaborate with coworkers and meet customer needs. So, Kim, first of all, let me turn this over to you. How does that definition land for you? And how do you contrast it maybe from a Radical Candor perspective, what you've described as rock star mode?
Yeah, at least my understanding, of quiet quitting, which is not everyone's understanding. We'll have a discussion about it. But in my understanding of quiet quitting, rockstar mode is totally different. When people are in rockstar mode, they're great at their job and they are doing a great job. They're not just meeting expectations, they're exceeding expectations, but they're not necessarily gunning for the next big job or the next promotion or whatever. So they're definitely going above and beyond, but they're not going above and beyond in order to get the next promotion necessarily. But what I think people, and I've been here in my career, and I imagine most people have, but there are times in our careers when we're doing the bare minimum not to get fired. We're not rocking the boat, we're not complaining much, but we're just trying to sort of fly under the radar screen and not get fired. And you're not going to do your best work, and you're not going to enjoy work as much when you're in that kind of mode. I don't know. What do you all think quiet quitting is? Who knows?
Jason, do you know?
I think since this term was just made up like a month ago, I feel we can take some liberties with how we define it. I think you are right that there's a distinction between rockstar mode and quiet quitting. I guess the way that I think about performance within a role at work is it's sort of like a bell curve of potential performance. And a small percentage.
Evil kind of bell curve, but mathematical. I'm referring to a horrible book. Anyway, please do continue. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I took us down a rabbit hole we didn't need to go down.
The mathematical shape, right? There are some percentage of people who are not gunning for a promotion who can do exceedingly well in that role because they maybe have expertise that extends beyond the sort of bounds of the role, or some skill or experience that extends slightly beyond the bounds of the role that make them especially good at delivering on what's inside the role. But most of the people in a role are going to fall into somewhere towards the middle of that bell curve. And I feel like we are talking about people who are doing well in the role, maybe not going above and beyond in the way that you're describing to be considered in rock star mode, but who certainly are not on the chopping block. They're not performing so poorly that they might be fired. They're performing well in the job, but they're simply not willing to go sort of above and beyond. They're not willing to push themselves to be at the top end of the bell curve.
So I would agree with everything you said, except for one word. You said they're performing well, and I would say they're performing okay. Well to me puts you on the right side. If there's a line in the middle of the bell curve,
fair.
They're on the left of the line that's in the middle of the bell curve. They're doing okay, not well. They're meeting and not missing expectations, but they're not meeting and sometimes exceeding expectations.
Yes, I feel like that's a helpful clarification. But if you can fill a role with someone who can consistently meet expectations, that is often great.
Yeah.
That is often a really good situation to be in. So I think the reason why we're having a conversation about quiet quitting at all is because there are a lot of people who companies were relying on their willingness to push themselves to the top end of that sort of performance curve in order to meet the company's objectives. even though they weren't necessarily compensating or recognizing people for doing that,
Yeah.
they were depending on them doing that without recognition or compensation. And people are now saying no. So now it's becoming very hard for teams to meet their goals because that discretionary effort, the desire to push themselves beyond the sort of somewhere in the middle of that bell curve, is what I think at least the opinion pieces that I've read about quiet quitting are referring to. It's the difference between being willing to sort of stay somewhere just to the left or to the right of that middle point on the curve and pushing yourself to be towards the top end.
Yeah, exactly.
Just going to bring in, Jason, a definition from what you were sharing from a recent Harvard Business Review piece by Jack Zenger and Joseph Folkman, who the introduction to this piece says, quiet quitting is a new name for an old behavior. And for decades, they've regularly been asking people to rate whether their, quote, work environment is a place where people want to go the extra mile. So this idea of going the extra mile, what they also refer to as, Jason, what you mentioned, discretionary effort. So I think what's interesting is you're talking about Jason is happy if someone meets expectations, and the quitting definition is really about not just meeting expectations, but going the extra mile. Kim, was that where you were going, or were you going the extra mile on that, or were you just...
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as we've talked about this before, but one of the least popular things that I did when I was working at Google was I said, if you meet expectations and never exceed expectations for 2 years in a row, we put you on a project where you will have an opportunity to exceed expectations. And if you fail, then we'll try to find a different role for you where you can. Because I feel like, in my experience anyway, the joy in work often comes from that discretionary effort where you're noticing something that is broken and you take a little extra effort to try to fix it. And the reason why I think that's important at work is it's important for you because if you don't try to fix it, then it becomes like a grain of sand in your shoe that's going to give you a blister, and it's going to become really painful over time.
Kim, can you share again what you mean by needing to review employees' performance if they keep meeting expectations? What was it, for 2 years? Was that the data point you were using?
Yeah, that's not a data point. That's an anecdote. But
the Kim Scott anecdote of 2 years. Okay.
I mean, there's nothing. In other words, sometimes it might be 3 years, sometimes it might be 1 year. It depends on the situation. But the question is, and I'd love your all's thoughts. My feeling is that if someone is never exceeding expectations, if they're always meeting expectations, it's a red flag about their boss, that their boss is not giving them the right opportunities or creating the right environment for them to really excel. I believe that there's no such thing as a B player, and a B is a pretty good grade. I think everybody can be exceptional at their work, and it's doing great work that usually creates a lot of the pleasure in work. It's hard to be enthusiastic about a job where you're just meeting expectations, I think. But I don't know. What do you all think?
I want to hear what Jason has to say, but if I can just share a personal story, because I think it gets into who is defining the expectations and are the expectations clearly and fairly assigned. So I will go back, if I may, to the 4th grade, when apparently, as family lore goes, rather than getting a check plot, whatever the top score was, superior or amazing or whatever, I got like a very good
gold star. You got a silver star. Or something.
Yeah. And so this was apparently a huge shock. And so upon learning at the parent-teacher conference that for Amy to get a gold star, an example would be like there was a new student and Amy welcomes the new student and takes the new student around. So in other words, because I had achieved a certain amount of success, there was like a new bar of what expectations were set. And so I guess just, Kim, as you were defining that, what was on my mind was, are expectations clear and equitable sort of in an organization is one thing that's on my mind.
Yeah, almost never, but
yeah.
So that's a problem. We should talk
That's a problem.
The thing that came to mind for me is whether or not the exceeding expectations thing is required to be good at the job. Because if it's required to be good at the job, then it should be the expectation, not exceeding expectations. And I think that it sort of feels pedantic, but one of the things that I found was really helpful when I was thinking about how do you create equitable job descriptions and equitable reviews is you have to make the actual expectations of good performance in a job very clear. And so if there's something that people really need to do well at the job, that should fall in the expectations. I think there's still a gradient, right? There's still the difference between someone who does everything that's required of them within the bounds of the job, does a good job at that, and then stretches beyond the job into other things to like make the team better, for example. Now, you don't have to be career ambitious, meaning you don't have to be gunning for the next job in order to do that. A lot of people do that because it makes them happy. To your point, Kim, like the excellence that comes from contributing in other ways beyond the bounds of your role is really exciting for a lot of people. It brings them joy and happiness, makes them feel more productive and successful at work. But I think, in my perspective, gets recognized on evaluation of performance, but it doesn't get recognized in terms of how well you are doing your job. It gets recognized in terms of like discretionary bonus and things like that, because you have gone beyond the bounds of the job and done something else. So like if I had someone who is meeting expectations consistently and by meeting expectations, we're delivering excellent results in their role. Like, because that's what I would say. Like, meeting expectations to me is like delivering great results for the role that you're in. Let's be more concrete. Let's take a salesperson, right? So like a salesperson who meets or sort of closely exceeds their goal on a regular basis, I would be happy with that.
So I think that what we're saying is similar, although it may sound different. I think rule number one for a manager to get great results out of their employees is to make the expectations explicit and clear.
Yep.
And also not to get too tied up in knots over the extrinsic part of the expectations. If everything gets graded, then you remove the pleasure of great work for its own sake. So that's some of the you want to make sure that you're creating space for people to get that intrinsic satisfaction out of their work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I really like that framing. And I think it helps us move, sort of double click into why people might want to leave their jobs, why quiet quitting is so important, especially now. And so going back to this piece in Harvard Business Review, in which the title was Quiet Quitting is About Bad Bosses, Not Bad Employees. And Kim, I feel like that's a topic that is near and dear to your heart. So they gathered data from about 3,000 managers who are rated by 5 or so direct reports on average. And they were exploring 2 data points. One was employees' ratings of their manager's ability to, quote, balance getting results with a concern for others' needs. So that was one data point. The other one was employees' ratings of the extent to which their, quote, work environment is a place where people want to go the extra mile. And this is what they call discretionary effort. And so what I think is really interesting is that managers who are rated the highest at balancing results with relationships.
I don't like the way they put that. I don't like the way they talked about it because it implies a false dichotomy. I either worry about results or I worry about my relationships. And it implies that anything I do for my relationships is going to hurt my results.
But Kim, what do you think this data suggests, since we want to talk about managers of managers? How can managers of managers read through this article, look at some of this data, and check in with their direct reports who are managing other people?
Yeah, so I want to say I totally and 100% agree with about quiet quitting that you just read. So I think one of the things that managers can do to take a look at their direct reports and understand how their relationship is going with their teams is to warn each of their direct reports about the problems of power and to teach them, because very often, I was thinking about this on my walk today, very often when a person becomes a manager, they view themselves as a nice person, as a person who's easy to get along with. They don't view themselves as intimidating, usually. They don't aspire to intimidate others. But very often what happens is that the fact that the person has some authority, has a little bit of power, makes the people around them inclined to interpret what they're saying, even though they're intending to be radically candid, there's very high likelihood that the kind of things they're saying are landing as obnoxious aggression for the team, and that the team is unwilling to challenge their authority. And so if you're a manager of managers, one of the most important things you can do to create an environment where that doesn't happen is to have speak truth to power meetings. And these are the meetings where you sit down with the direct reports of your direct reports and you ask them, so let's say that, Amy, you're doing this for me. Well, hopefully I have 5 direct reports. And you sit down with my 5 direct reports. I'm not in the room. And you say, what could Kim do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with her? And then it's a not for attribution meeting. So you're going to tell me what happened in that meeting. But you're not going to tell me who said what, but you're going to tell me what was said. And you're going to take notes and you're going to project them so that others can read them. So that if someone says something that is going to be attributed to them in a way they're not comfortable with, they can ask you to delete it. And then you're going to sit down with me and you're going to talk to me about the 3 things I'm going to change, the 3 things I'm going to do differently to communicate to people that I heard what they said, and to make my listening tangible, that I heard what they said and I'm changing. I'm open to this feedback. And that is, I think, one of the most important things you can do. One of the dangerous things that managers of managers do is they take a look at employee satisfaction surveys, employee engagement surveys, and they start acting on the numbers rather than investigating. I think having actually these often called skip level meetings, I prefer to call them speak truth to power meetings, is one important thing that a managers can do to make sure that they know who on their team is having trouble. And you want to do this in the spirit of helping people become better managers, not creating some sort of Stalinist, I'm going to report on you behind your back way.
Is there something, Kim, that you learned as a manager of managers from the skip level meetings? In other words, did you have a boss who led one of these meetings and shared feedback with you, and what you found was a helpful way to lead that meeting of how do you debrief your direct report with those
No, alas,
findings?
I did not have such a boss. I wish I had. But I did get advice from someone named Roxana Wales, who worked with me at Google. She was in learning and development at Google. And before that, she had worked at NASA. And she was the one who explained to me about skip level meetings. And so I did it. I took her advice and I had her do it for me. So she met with my direct reports.
Okay.
And told me what I was doing wrong.
So you did do it?
Yeah, she wasn't my boss.
Okay.
But
yeah, what would you want that person to do how did she give you the information? What made it presented in a way that could land for you?
Well, I mean, I asked her to do it. And so hopefully I was open to the feedback. But basically what she did was she took notes during the meeting, projected it for each of my direct reports so they could watch what she was writing. So they knew exactly what she said. This is what I'm telling Kim. I'm going to give Kim this report. So there was more transparency, which created a little bit of trust in the process. Mm-hmm. And then she shared it with me and she asked me, what are you going to do based on these notes? And I came up with some things and she said, well, I think you should do more of this, less of that. But I think if you are a manager of managers and you're going to roll out these speak truth to power meetings, it's important that you describe the process to your team, to everyone, and say, I'm going to do this for all of y'all. And then you get questions, you answer concerns, and then you get them to describe what's about to happen to their teams, so that everyone knows that you're doing this as part of helping your direct reports be better managers. You're not doing it to try to figure out who sucks and fire them. It's got to be presented very carefully to your direct reports, and then you want them to own the messaging to their teams that you're going to come in and meet with them.
Jason, any reflections from your own experience on speak truth to power skip level meetings?
Well, I was just going to say that I was thinking I've had people do this for me, but none of them have been my manager either. Although there was one situation where it was like an anniversary that I had, and we were all out to dinner. My boss was there, and it was sort of a joke, but he said, we all love Jason. So like people were saying such nice things about him. He's like, we all love Jason, but like, what's one thing that Jason does that really ticks you off? And then someone told the story about how when I interviewed them, that I gave them no emotional reaction to work with. And they were so flustered by this, they felt like it completely derailed them in like the rest of the interview process. They were like, you're just inscrutable. Like I couldn't tell what you were thinking. By the end of it, I just assumed that I had done horribly. Like I assumed that at some point react positively to something. And I remember thinking like, wow, that is probably one of the most helpful, clear, and insightful pieces of feedback that I've ever been given. And it sort of like happened as a joke, but it was in this context where sort of like trust had been established. And I think the fact that my boss was asking and that I was there and I demonstrated already that I was very open to feedback, it created sort of a different environment. So was there
alcohol involved in this?
There was a little bit of migration also involved.
Please consult with your medical professional before trying this at your own place of work.
I cannot drink anymore because I like to drink too much. So I'm not encouraging drinking at work, but I acknowledge it does sometimes help.
I think it's very interesting that neither of you had your quote managers bring this up, and you almost had to proactively seek this out. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting on my team at Google. Once I started doing the skip level meetings, and I did them in a way that was support. Everyone wanted to have more skip level. Like I could have spent all my time doing skip level meetings. So I will warn you, especially if you have a big team, like there were, 700 people or something on the team. You want to make sure that you set some boundaries around the skip level meetings, because pretty soon you can spend all your time doing them. So you say, I'm going to do it once a year. I'm going to do it for my direct reports. Their direct reports are going to do it for their direct reports. And then you also want to provide some way to make sure that people who are brand new in your organization, depends on how big your organization is, but people who are 5 levels quote unquote below. I don't know how to talk about hierarchy without this above and below language, which I hate. But anyway, that are 5 levels reporting up through you. You want to make sure you create opportunities for them to come to you. And that's where sort of having an open Q&A at an all hands where anyone can stand up and ask you a question and where kind of walking around helps.
Yeah. I just want to make something explicit that I believe has been implicit during this conversation. In order to make these skip level meetings really actionable, the expectations of what a good manager does also need to be clear.
Yes.
Not just to the manager, but to the team that they are supporting.
Yes.
And I think this is one of the things that a lot of organizations miss, in part because management is not seen as a discipline unto itself. It is often seen as sort of your side job that you do in addition to some other technical work that you are responsible for. So a lot of managers of people are sort of project managers with a side job of managing the humans on the project also. Those are the perfect conditions to lead to quiet quitting.
Yes.
Because something is going to give. And it is often the really hard thing that gets pushed. And the really hard thing between project management and people management is people management. Like the actual...
Projects don't talk back.
Exactly. Like there's a schedule and things are objective. It's like very attractive to like focus on the project and not as much on the people. Because I think it is helpful when you're dealing with people who have some experience with being managed to ask a broad question like, what could Kim do to make it easier to work with her? So again, as a manager of managers, that kind of question I think works reasonably well. When you're doing skip levels for someone who maybe has less experienced people on the team, maybe this is their first job, for example. I dealt with a lot of managers who were managing people who was their first job out of college. Like what a manager is supposed to do. And giving that to them, saying, I want you to think about this. This is the job description for what your manager does. My goal, Kim, to your point, is to help your manager get better. That's the spirit that I'm having this conversation with you. That's the spirit in which I'm having this conversation with you. But that really did help ground things because, like, very tactically, you sort of a throwaway comment, but I think it's quite important, Kim, is like the question of like, how do you spend this time and who do you do these meetings for? At what cadence? How do you prioritize? If you don't have time to do it all at once, how you prioritize? I do think engagement surveys are valuable sources of data. They're not sources of answers. They're sources of sort of like, they're heat detection.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say. They are a smoke alarm. They are not the fire department. You, manager of managers, you are the fire department. I think if I were a manager of managers listening to this, I'd be sweating right now because I'm like, oh shit, now I got to go and I got to write a job description for the people management part and I don't know what to write. I'm going to write it for you right now. You can take it or leave it. But here's what your managers who are working for you ought to be doing for their teams, and here's what you ought to be doing for them. Soliciting feedback. You ought to be giving praise. You ought to be giving criticism. You ought to be encouraging a culture of feedback, aka preventing backstabbing. You ought to be having career conversations. You ought to be thinking about sort of growth management. You ought to engage in some sort of growth management process. If you don't know what I mean by that, just skip it for now. We'll talk about it on another podcast. You ought to be having one-on-ones with each of your direct reports, ideally on a weekly basis. You ought to be having a very clear decision process. The decision process on your team ought to be transparent and clear to everyone. And you want to be setting goals. And if you do those things as a manager, there's more to it, but if you do those things, you're at least meeting expectations.
If only there was a book that outlined these steps, Kim. Can you imagine a book like that? Radical Candor. What are the odds?
The TL do read version is what I just said. Like, it's not going to take you forever to write job description for your people managers. It's about soliciting feedback, giving feedback, helping understand people's career aspirations and setting goals if you want it, the even shorter version.
Well, I think that's really helpful. I like it a lot too. And I think what's interesting, both in our definition of quiet quitting, this whole conversation around, do people need to meet expectations, exceed expectations? Number one, have we clearly defined what expectations are and what good looks like? And have we defined what the role of a people manager is? So clarity is obviously a big part of Radical Candor.
One of the problems with being a manager is that you, as a manager, are likely to be the projection screen on which all of your employees project their unresolved authority issues. And what I mean by that is you are very likely to be perceived as an asshole. And even if you're like not a bona fide, but you're very likely to be perceived that way. And if you can talk, if you're a manager of managers and you can talk, and that is an isolating, upsetting thing. And very often when we are
What is isolating? To be a manager of managers or to be an asshole, perceived as an asshole?
To be perceived as an asshole.
Okay, all right. Just want to be clear.
I mean, both things are kind of isolating, but what I meant in this case was, and very often, unfortunately, what happens is when someone is perceived as an asshole, they get frustrated by that and they start to behave like an asshole. So don't let that happen to you. And if you're a manager of managers, one of the things you can do to help your team deal with this sort of upsetting and isolating thing is everybody thinks you're a jerk, is to talk to them about it. Talk to them. How are we as a team going to manage this unfair situation that most people who are managers are going to have with at least half the people on their team are going to be projecting their sort of unresolved authority issues onto you. So I think that just having that conversation and holding space for a little group therapy on this situation is another really good thing that you can do, because if you read, there's a great book written by Bob Sutton called The Asshole Survival Guide. And he offers a lot of suggestions, many of which are basically quiet quitting. Like that's a coping mechanism if you're working for. And so if you understand the problem that it causes for your team and their performance when they perceive you as it may not be fair that they perceive you as an asshole, but fair or not, it's your problem to solve if you're a manager. And so just talk to your team about that. Have a little group therapy on that topic.
Jason, you're nodding. Anything more to add on the asshole anonymous or not so anonymous meetings? Have you ever been involved in any of these that Kim speaks of?
I feel like I have been guilty of this at various times because, to Kim's point, like if you think of yourself as sort of a nice person or a good person, there's a temptation when you're told that you're not living up to your own expectation of yourself. Often this is not something someone else is setting for you, but there's a temptation to be like, okay, well, you think I'm a jerk? Now I'm really gonna let me
show you, jerk.
Let's show you how bad it can get. I do think there's real merit to helping, especially new managers, sort of distance themselves from the role of management. Like, it's very tempting to conflate management with parenting, for example. There's often metaphors that are, like parenting metaphors are very common in management. It's problematic for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which is like, for many people, being a parent is a part of who they are. And so some of that carries over. You start to use that metaphor, it carries over into management. But like seeing it as a set of skills that are separate from yourself, the things that you can get better at, I think that goes a long way to helping the sort of like assholes anonymous problem.
Can I share a story? So I was giving someone some feedback one time, and his response was...
Just once.
Just once.
Yeah.
And his response was, don't worry about it. I don't listen to anyone, starting with my mother.
Oh my God.
Yes. So what do I wish I had said in that moment? Like, just because you had a problematic relationship with your mother doesn't mean you have to have a problematic relationship with every woman you encounter thereafter. But I think this kind of thing happens. And I don't think that I was being an asshole when I gave him the feedback. But he perceived me, or I don't think he would have called it asshole. He perceived me, he thought I was being a bitch, just like his mother. And so it was like one of those moments where, and probably his mother wasn't a bitch, by the way, but there were many levels to how problematic the moment was. One was the gender neutral, authority issue. And then the other, then you layer gender on top of it, and it became much more complicated. And so I think that's an example of what is happening to your managers. They're getting these comments. It was a hard situation for me because I was the one in the situation who had the power. And yet I felt like I was sort of being attacked unfairly. And so if the more you can share stories like that with your team and talk about how to manage those moments, the better. It's a complicated moment.
Yeah.
I am going to say something which I hope we'll edit out, but I'm going to be like, let me ask Dad what he thinks of that. Jason?
Kim, I think the story is sort of a perfect encapsulation of why it's so important to try to separate create some professional distance, like from the job of management and the projections that people have about authority. Like, I do think that the relationship between authority and engagement is that when authority is used as a way to sort of protect a team's ability to get work done, when you use the power you have to sort of elevate the people on your team, that is what gets you the sort of discretionary effort that we've been talking about. But people are waiting for you to use that authority in a way that feels unfair so that they can then project onto you all of those unresolved issues that they have. And that's the part that feels so crappy about being a manager. It's like, I slipped up for 1 second. I used you know what I'm saying? Like, and as you become aware of this, as you become aware of like the moments when you're throwing your power around, for example, I remember in a design review meeting, there was this moment where I was like, I just expressed very bluntly my dissatisfaction with the direction that something had taken. And I was really sitting in my own opinion. I wasn't speaking for the company. I wasn't even saying that I'm right. I was like, it's just like a bummer that we wound up right here. And I could see in that moment the crestfallen expressions on all of the people's faces. And I was like, damn it. This is just like human emotion coming out like in the moment. And I knew that I was going to have to walk that back. Like I was going to have to contextualize where that came from. And it was very hard because I knew people felt as though I was disappointed in them when that's not what was happening. And I knew that I was going to have to manage that reaction. So as opposed to even saying this is my intention and I know that's not the outcome, that wasn't enough because the disappointment was still going to be there. Like the feeling they'd been scolded was still going to be there. Even though I wasn't talking about what they did, I was talking about how I felt. So I feel for managers out there who find themselves in that situation and find it really hard to dig out.
I actually think this is a really important topic, but I wonder if our job, work is a family. This team is a family. Like how often that can be manipulated, right? To go to Jason's point. Like, I guess when you hear people saying that, companies saying, we're a family here, how would you instruct individual employees to respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's problematic even when it's not being used in a manipulative way. But when it's being used specifically in a manipulative way, it's designed to create a sense of obligation. You are, because we are a family, you are obliged to do certain things without recognition or reward because we're a family, because you don't reward your family for doing things. It's just part of being a family. Whenever anybody says that, I always joke of my family's pretty dysfunctional. If my team was as dysfunctional as my family, that would be a serious problem. I would see that as a real issue to be solved. I've been in therapy for many years trying to deal with the unresolved problems of my family. So I feel even when it's done with the best of intentions, it can be problematic because it sends the sort of wrong message. But the manipulative version of it is really terrible because it is an excuse. Often roles inside of families are unclear. So that's a great way to say, well, we don't have to put everything in a job description because we all carry the weight and isn't it fair? Because just like in a family, in those situations, the work gets unfairly distributed. So that's why you want to create job description That's why it's important to recognize the value of the differences between a team at work and a family, because a team at work can be designed in a better way to make it so that more of the work is distributed more equitably and people can be great at what they do, which is not a thing that a lot of people feel in the context of their role inside their family.
I agree with everything you just said, Jason. I would add the great thing about a family is that it's all intrinsically. I mean, there may be some, I don't know, there may be some extrinsic, but for most families, it's intrinsic motivation. You do things for each other because you love each other. And that's good. And so in terms of wanting to get to intrinsic motivation, I applaud that. But the other thing about a family is you don't get paid for any of that work, and you're getting paid at work. So, and furthermore, the other thing about family is quitting a family is really, really, really a big deal. And quitting a job should not be that big of a deal. And I don't want to say you can't quit your family, because people can and do, and sometimes that's necessary. But as by and large, hopefully you don't have to quit your family. And hopefully you stick with it in a way that would be unreasonable to expect of your job. And so I think that, to me, one of the great things about work is that, as you say, Jason, the boundaries are more clear there, and the roles are clear. And if it gets bad, you can leave without feeling terrible about it, hopefully. So you do not want to confuse. The other thing I would say is read Acceptance, this memoir, Acceptance. It is so beautiful. And she writes a lot about, there's a chapter on why your work can't be your family.
Yeah. Well, I think it seems especially relevant now. So just to touch briefly on engagement, Gallup notes that the proportion of employees who are not engaged at work, it's actually the highest in a decade, about half of the U.S. workforce. And in fact, 18% consider themselves actively disengaged. These are people who, quote, tend to have most of their workplace needs unmet and spread their dissatisfaction. And a lot of that is related to what we were just talking about, clarity of expectations, people not feeling like they have opportunities to learn and grow, they don't feel cared about or connected to the organization's mission or purpose. And so, Jason, when you look at some of the data from Gallup, we'll put it in the show notes, but what does this data suggest for managers of managers who we're really focusing on for this podcast?
Well, first of all, I think it's really easy to see, well, half of employees aren't engaged. So like, can I really even use this information that I'm getting back from my engagement? The engagement's so bad. Like, is this even really a signal anymore? And to them, I would say relative engagement is still really valuable. Even if you're in an industry that is declining, for example, that's going to drive engagement down. So let's pretend that the average was much higher. And you're in an industry that's declining in your area, that often drives engagement down because people feel like career prospects aren't great and things like that. There's not a lot of opportunity for growth. It's still valuable to look at relative engagement, like the engagement of one of the team, the people reporting to one manager versus the engagement of people reporting to another manager. That's still a valuable signal. Again, it's the smoke alarm. It's not the fire, but it is still really valuable to look at that. And that's why I found it so useful to make sure that the tools that I selected when I was a larger organization allowed me to differentiate between managers, for example, like the engagement score on one team versus another. And the other thing that I will say is that it's really important to treat negative deviations in engagement seriously, because the point about the sort of contagion of bad relationships with a manager, like how that affects those individual team members is one thing, but how they talk about it to like other people in your company, it's like it's going to cause a problem. And maybe you get in there and what you realize is like after you do some skip level or speak truth with power meetings, like you realize, oh, they just had a really tough quarter, they didn't meet expectations, something went wrong. Great. Whew. So you can wipe the sweat off your brow that I've been collecting there and say, okay, we're going to pay attention to this, but we'll revisit it next quarter. But often what will happen is you will find very clear, specific things that manager needs to do differently in order to help his team feel, or her team feel, more engaged. And that's a gift, because my experience with running skip level meetings is that the feedback is often very clear and very actionable. Like there's literally stuff that person can start doing tomorrow that's going to make a difference in how people perceived that, not even just perceived, but experienced their leadership.
Can I wave a purple flag?
Yes.
Their team. I think often when I am saying his and then I say his or her, it's better to, I prefer now to say their. My daughter has taught me this, because there's plenty of non-binary managers out there. And
Great.
Also non-binary managers of managers.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And Kim, for folks that are just hearing about the purple flag for the first time,
that is a bias disruptor. You can read more about that in Just Work.
All right. Well, we're going to get into our tips in just a moment. So, Kim, you have many turns of phrase that one learns to love, and one of them was about being a shit umbrella for your team. Now, the issue is if what's trickling down from the top is toxic, if you're the manager of a manager who is not doing their job well, you don't really want to be a shit umbrella in that case. You don't want to be protecting the poorly performing manager who's reporting to you. The team has a boss that's a jerk, and this boss that's a jerk reports to you. How do you shield? Yeah. How do you get the umbrella?
Your job in that situation is to hold that manager accountable, not to protect that man. Okay, now I'm tracking. Sorry,
You're tracking.
It took me a minute. Yes, you're correct. Your job as a manager of managers is to hold the managers who work for you accountable for being good bosses. And you want to, hold them accountable, but also you want to give them the coaching that they need to become better, to get better as bosses. And so the point of a Speak Truth to Power meeting is to get more information about what you can do to help the managers who work for you not either be assholes or be perceived as assholes. And if a person is not making changes, you need to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I think the reason why this came to mind is that I have worked with other managers of managers who get confused about the shit umbrella metaphor. And they don't understand that the reason that's important is you're trying to shield your team, in this case, a team of managers, from the unfair influence of things that are out of their control. You're not trying to shield them from the fair consequences of things that are in their control. And it can feel sometimes like the team, because, we did this earlier, right? We were like, oh, it's so hard to be a manager. You sort of relate to them. You're like, this is a really difficult situation. It can be easy to kind of like take on that protective stance, even when it is actually very, like, they're experiencing the consequences of actions that were under their control, and you need to hold them accountable for those.
Yeah. I think the reason, Amy, that I wasn't tracking your question is that I'm such a visual person. I'm thinking of an umbrella. And when you're a shit umbrella, you're shielding your team from stuff that's coming from the sky, from above you, right? And so the idea of shit coming from under you, the last thing you want to do is hold your umbrella up and let the shit pile up underneath it. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's why I was having a hard time tracking your question. I'm like, but the shit doesn't come from underneath you. But of course, the shit actually can come from underneath you. And it's your job to be the shit sweeper for your managers.
Unfortunately, Kim, that umbrella has hierarchy and levels implicit in it.
I know.
It has gravity is involved. So
yes,
it's
gravity. Look, a hierarchy is a thing, as is gravity. And it's a useful thing as long as you remember that your job as a boss and that you teach the managers who work for you that their job is to be a boss. And it is a job for which you get held accountable. It's not a value judgment on who you are as a person.
Well, now it's time for our Radical Candor checklist tips you can use to start putting Radical Candor into practice.
Tip number 1, get curious about why some people on your team are disengaged. When you look at your engagement metrics, don't assume that all of the managers who have teammates who are engaged are doing the right thing. Don't assume that all of the managers who have disengaged teams are doing the wrong thing. Take time to have these speak truth to power meetings and get curious about what's going on in these teams. So what is a speak truth to power meeting? This is an excellent segue to tip number 2.
Tip number 2, our manager of managers, it's often difficult to have visibility into everything that is going on among the team members that each of your managers is managing. So speak truth to power meetings, which Kim described in this episode, are a really helpful way to scale your ability to understand what might be working for a team and what might not be working for a team, and to use that information to help your managers grow and get better.
Tip number 3, remember, relationships don't scale, but culture does. This means that while you can't have a close relationship with every person who reports to the people who report to you, practicing radical candor with the people you do manage can impact how they interact with the people they manage, and so on and so forth. Without a culture of trust, which has been identified as the most important factor in determining engagement, you're not going to be able to build these critical relationships.
Tip number 4, have a little group therapy meeting with your team about how they are a projection screen for everyone's unresolved authority issues. Very often, managers are perceived as obnoxiously aggressive or as assholes, even though they're not really assholes fundamentally. And very often when a team perceives their boss as a jerk, they respond with manipulative insincerity. And I'm going to end this by saying manipulative insincerity is another form of quiet quitting. So help your managers learn how to prove to their teams that they are radically candid and not obnoxiously aggressive.
All right. For more tips, radicalcandor.com/resources. You can download our learning guides for practicing radical candor. To see the show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. If you like what you hear, go ahead, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Don't forget to order the latest hardcover copy of my second book. It's actually my 6th book, but my second published book, Just Work: How to Root Out Bias, Prejudice, and Bullying to Create a Kick-Ass Culture of Inclusivity. Available everywhere books are sold.
Looking for Radical Candor swag? Go to radicalcandor.com. Click the shop link for coffee mugs, sweatshirts, stickers, and more. Bye for now. Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.
you.